Japanese organized criminals invading West. One of the headlines that took Americans by surprise in the early 80s. Less than a decade ago, Americans neither knew nor cared about Japanese organized crime. Now, not only was it a serious issue, but in 1983, Yakuza would be actually included in the organized crime agenda of President Reagan. But the surprise was not really what Yakuza was doing. The USA was not a stranger to organized crime, but that it was coming from Japan. Japan and the Japanese Americans were widely believed to be fairly distant to criminal activity, let alone organized crime. So how did this all happen? Well, in most immigrant communities, organized crime appears pretty much the moment the population grows large enough to support it. And by the 1910s, the USA had enough people of Japanese descent, mainly concentrated around Los Angeles, to do so. Here in Little Tokyo, most criminal as well as other activities were centered around a location called Tokyo Club. Functioning as a bank and controlling all the gambling activity, Tokyo Club became a successful enterprise. And these people had the customs and practices of what we call today Yakuza. But in the 1930s, Yakuza activities in America started to become more than just gambling and small-time rackets. In its homeland, the Yakuza had spent previous decades spearheading fascism and military expansion. After World War I, Yakuza invested a significant amount of resources to promote and support the invasion of Korea and Manchuria. And now that Manchuria was under the control of Japan, Yakuza got its hand on an extremely lucrative asset, opium. From Tianjin, Japan was controlling a huge part of the world opium trade, and Yakuza, the fervent supporter of this invasion, was ready to profit. So much so that the chief of the Narcotic Bureau was saying that the Japanese were responsible for 90% of all the illegal white drugs in the world. And Japanese narcotics, of course, started to appear in America only a year after the invasion of Manchuria. The Japanese gangs were not only selling these opiates themselves, but were also supplying the largest drug rings in the country. This included the Italian and Jewish mobs. The business was booming. But all this profitable affair came to an end with World War II. Yakuza was already losing power at home, and as a result of the war declaration, about 120,000 Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps. This of course included the people who ran the crime rings, bringing an abrupt end to Japanese narcotic dominance and the Tokyo Club. The next decades after World War II would see extremely low crime rates among Americans of Japanese descent, which is why America was caught off guard in the 1980s. Of course, Yakuza activity did not completely stop during this period. Even though it lost the dominant position it used to have in narcotics, Yakuza spent these years slowly rebuilding its crime network and making its way back to American soil. The perfect springboard for this was, of course, the location that caused the bitter enmity between these two nations in the war: Hawaii. From here, Yakuza started to once again set up its operations in the mainland. Both Hawaii and California were suitable for creating an organized crime syndicate because of their large population of Japanese descent and relative absence of traditional Italian syndicates. What made this resurrection even more effortless was the fact that because of the low crime rates among the Japanese, the cargo coming from Japan was entering the country virtually without any customs checks. So without any major hiccups, Yakuza was back in business in America. But this time, drugs did not make up such a huge part of the Yakuza activity. After World War II, Japanese gangs once again started diversifying their crime portfolio, which included drugs, extortion, trafficking, adult entertainment, smuggling weapons, and of course the foundation of every organized criminal network: money laundering. While the Yakuza drug network was working from Japan to America, trafficking was moving in the other direction. Yakuza would establish fronts with paid agents on the West Coast, which would lure American women with ads for singers and dancers. Then these women would be forced or tricked into being trafficked to Japan, where they would become victims of a nightmarish experience of exploitation. Extortion and racketeering activities of Yakuza were targeted not only on the Japanese businesses, but also at one of Yakuza's favorite industries: tourism. Every year, hundreds of thousands of Japanese tourists would visit California and collectively spend millions of dollars. And Yakuza would make sure that every single dime would go to their pockets. Japanese tourists would be tricked or bullied into choosing the tours owned by the Japanese gangs, or they would be hustled into gift shops and then intimidated into buying overpriced gifts. Gun smuggling, on the other hand, was not really a business for Yakuza as much as shopping. They would earn a certain markup, that's true, but more than anything, the guns were the tools of the trade for the Yakuza. And these tools have been very difficult to come by in Japan, since the country has been traditionally very stern about the gun restrictions. Japanese civilians on paper did not and could not own any firearms, while their American counterparts owned literally in the hundreds of millions. So after the disarming of Japan following World War II, American smugglers have been happily rearming the country's criminal underworld, which was made easy by the fact that there were tens of thousands of American troops stationed in the islands, which were often short on cash in a country full of attractive distractions. Thanks to this smuggling network, which sometimes included high-ranking officials, by the 80s, American guns were sponsoring internal feuds of the Yakuza. In the money laundering business, of course, casinos were the most sought-after establishments. But Yakuza had a difficult time getting their hands on these enterprises. For example, in the late 70s, Ryoichi Sasakawa, a Japanese businessman and possible war criminal with ties to Yakuza and some of the most prominent fascists of the 20th century, tried to acquire a casino in Atlantic City. But authorities, fearing that this would become the largest Japanese money laundering operation in the country, shut down the project. Even though Sasakawa couldn't become the owner of a casino in America, he would later become friends with people like the Pope and the President of the United States, and just like his hero Mussolini, he would be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Twice. Yakuza wouldn't have better luck on the West Coast either. Even though Las Vegas seemed like the perfect place for these types of endeavors, no foreigner would be allowed to own a casino here until the 90s. But Las Vegas presented another opportunity for the Japanese criminal world: fraternizing with the Italian mafia. This allowed Yakuza to cooperate with other, more traditional mobs and establish connections with places where it cannot directly reach. Actually, members of both Japanese and American crime worlds have often been better at collaborating than their law enforcement counterparts. Which is why the Yakuza does not have to go big to make a lot of money. They don't have to fight and overpower the cops or other criminal gangs in America. They can prosper by just coexisting with them. Because as every organized crime syndicate knows, business is business.